Hello, and welcome to week 15 in the psychology of personality. And this is my last video. This is the last week in which we have content. Then there's another week. If you're going to be late on things, that's when you can be late on things. That's, kind of group things together. I do know that I just received an email today that the course evaluations are available. Please get those done. I read those and I use them to guide my practice. And then some, like on the 15th or something, the grade portal opens up. And then that's the opportunity for me to submit final grades. So we have a couple chapters to end off our time together here. The first one, chapter 19, cognitive perspectives and on personality. And then chapter 20, personality disorders, probably should have been separated into its own week. But nonetheless, let's take a first look at chapter 15, cognitive perspectives. And I'm I would consider myself, in terms of developmental psych, my work on the identity and whatnot, consider myself a constructivist. Now, constructivism arises from initially the work of Jean Piaget. His idea was that we use assimilation and accommodation as we have experiences, and we develop over time increasingly complex schemas or ideas or concepts. Or he used the word schemas, which I think is a nice term to describe any one of these sort of internalized ideas that we have. And one of those schemas, or maybe many schemas together, as my puzzle pieces theory would advocate for, are regarding personality. So we construct these. So there's an active process. It is reactive to the environment, but it's also expressions of free will, where we make choices, we expose ourselves to things, we refuse to take chances, we don't open doors of opportunity, we do open doors of opportunity. And what we are doing over the course of our lifespan is essentially constructing what our personality is, a very, very personal aspect of ourselves. And probably to me, um, not only is it a good theory in terms of the process of developing our personality, but it also leaves all kinds of room for the ways in which we measure personality. So, although I might be picking certain experiences, because of how I see them as advantageous to myself, by picking those things, I develop skills and habits and whatnot that then reflect themselves in the test, like the Big Five or the Myers-Briggs or any one of those other tests. Those things start to realize. And interestingly enough, those tests sometimes give you the language that you need to be able to describe the aspects of personality that you yourself created. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you let go of all that psychometric stuff that we have. I think that's really, really cool stuff. But ultimately, you're in charge of your personality. So, in this chapter, we kind of cover a few things. First, there's, of course, Piaget's schemas. And he was a cognitive psychologist, creating how we come to know things. Genetic epistemology was the name of his theory, the official name. Kind of call it Piaget's cognitive theory now, but genetic epistemology. Genetic referring to the term genesis, or how it comes about, and epistemology are the ways we know things. So his theory was, how do we get to know things over time? A very, very accurate term. I prefer to refer to his theory in its original terminology. Then we get into George Kelly. Now, Kelly came along, and I think I want to include this one, um, because it kind of reflects. I'm getting the course book ready so we can go over this a little bit. Modern neuroscience. A little plug. I'm teaching neuroscience at UMA in the spring. So if you want to take another class from me, I'm going to be teaching this, and this is definitely going to make, this idea is definitely going to make it into that class. Modern neuroscience is looking at the idea that the brain, the activity of the brain, is continually trying to predict the future. This is adaptive. So we're walking along the street, and the processes that we are going through for self-protection, basically ingrained into the genome, is I'm gathering information in order to anticipate what's coming. This sort of, let me guess what's next so I can prepare. And what we have actually seen is instances where the brain has guessed correctly, is effectively predict the future, and has started our reaction to a stimulus prior to us having been exposed to that stimulus. This is actually pretty amazing. The workings of that are still under study, still evade us. But what we see in this theory, this sort of, that came out from Kelly, is the fundamental idea of the personality is that we channel psychological processes in order to predict the future. And those constructs that we have created through experience, again, we're still within that constructionist cognitive model, these structures actually form the personality. It has an anticipatory quality to it. Now I go into the course book here, as we take a look at that. We have what he referred to as corollaries. So you look at the first one, and we see this idea that's starting to emerge from neuroscience. We have the construction corollary. A person anticipates events by constructing the replicas in the mind. We can anticipate our future because many of the factors associated with our future are in effect today. The next one we see is an individuality corollary. People differ in terms of the construction of events. Now, this is clearly when we talk about memory, right? You know, when we're looking about how we store information in order to understand how to predict our future in that little magical short time, you have probably all been in a situation where you arrive at home or something like this, and then two people have been out something, and yet you have two very different recollection of the events. I kind of use arguments because arguments tend to elicit selective memory. We tend to, when we're in an argument with somebody, we tend to remember the things where we're winning, tend to ignore where we're losing, so we can kind of have a memory of the best of scenarios here. And certainly, I have encountered myself, and certainly with talking with other people, that individuals have come out of an argument, and there's nothing as good as a good argument about the argument, right? Look, you said this when we were talking about, I didn't say that, you know, and stuff. And yet we have this reality, truthfully. Now there might be some, you know, some manipulation going on, stuff like that. You know, that's to look at. But truthfully, those two people had two very different experiences, and they processed the same events in very different ways. And we see that reflected in this anticipatory creation here. Even though we may share circumstances with other people, we have our unique constructs about the circumstances. Then we have organizational corollary. Each person sees a set of relationships between constructs and reality. We have our unique interpretations of how things relate to each other. That organization is not thinking about, you know, civil organizations, you know, or like the government or something like in schools. What it has to do with is the organization of these ideas and how they interrelate with each other. And that is unique to each one of us. That's a construction in and of itself, how these things relate to one another. You have a dichotomy corollary. The entirety of the construction is made up of a finite number of dichotomous constructions. We see the world in opposites, pros and cons, yes or no, positive, negative. And this sort of, it brings about the idea that ultimately we can exist within a gray world where things are not yes, no, either or, but at the end of the day, we have to make a decision. And this mechanism, let's say it paints things. Let's call, and I hate to pick colors because it's not fair, but let's call good things blue and let's call bad things red, and then, so, well, that's too political, isn't it? Let me just pick other colors. Yellow is good and brown is bad. Or let's say, again, I'm really struggling with purple. Yellow is good, purple is bad. And remove all reference to any sort of implications from my selection of those colors. In a way, we paint everything a color, and that's part of its identity. This internalized idea, it's good or bad, we paint it. So we recognize, even though there might be nuances, we recognize and we sort of lean toward one way or the other, because ultimately we have to make a decision. I think it's a powerful corollary in terms of the ways, again, we're looking at the construction of a personality and how we use that personality to make decisions about what we're going to do. Here we go. Choice corollary. A person chooses for themselves from the two options in the dichotomy. Range corollary. The constructs that we have are limited to the prediction of a range of events, not everything. So these are limited. The experience corollary. The systems we create to represent our circumstances change as we become more experienced. Modulation corollary. Some of the factors that can, got a little spelling mistake there, modify my constructions are easier to modify than others. You can probably imagine, this is, if you think of this in terms of trauma, that trauma produces a situational corollary that elicits a choice between my behaviors, ultimately one way or the other, pretty black and white in that idea. And then those are difficult to change. Having a bad experience, let's say, with an instructor, and then you set up a meeting, you meet with that instructor, and you talk, kind of work things out about what, how to communicate and whatnot. In the end, you're like, hey, that person's not so bad. And then so you have the trauma-related ones might take a little bit more work to change the factors associated with that corollary. And then we have the ones that may be more amenable to change. Then we have fragmentation corollary. We've got a whole bunch here. Since we have many constructions to choose from, we can employ any one of them to anticipate or respond to changes in the environment. This also means we could maybe choose the wrong ones. We might take a corollary from some other experience and we mistakenly apply it. Maybe that's a kind of a way in which we think about prejudice. We over apply one of these corollaries from our experience or from what we've been told or whatever, we apply it haphazardly, maybe inaccurately. Then we got a couple more here. Commonality corollary. We can sometimes be on the same page with others when we're going through this. And finally, sociality corollary. As I play out my constructs and navigate in my world, my actions impact the constructs and actions of others, and that feedback can modify my own. So this is a rather, I won't say complicated, but there's lots of parts. It's complex, each one of these pieces. And I think maybe you can sort of latch on to where each one of these could explain some behaviors. Now, keep in mind, this is rules of engagement that we have constructed ourselves through experience. So faulty rules, trauma, misunderstandings, all or none thinking, irrational thinking can all become embedded in these things, along with all the positive ways in which we process information in our lives. And those can be patterns, and those patterns essentially make up a picture of our personality in this case. So I think that that's a really interesting theory, and this would be a great group discussion to just go through each one of these and kind of think about how that one could be applied in our lives. Okay, so the next theory we're looking at is the narrative identity theory, and interestingly enough, I think that at the beginning of this class, I ask you to identify. I ask you to identify some of your favorite theories. And a lot of people like a narrative. Essentially, you're writing a book. You're writing, or a screenplay, probably a better way. And you're selecting actors to be a part of your play. You are the director. You're the director to the degree that you have internal or external locus of control. Are you giving more directorial capacities to people on your looking glass self? Or are you holding on to more of that control yourself? Are you able to manage that? The whole difficulties of being a producer, director. You're also the star of this particular story. Do you emphasize the star? Do you create a star that's more amenable to how you perceive people want to see the star? Start getting into that, the Carl Rogers self, and all of these pieces can kind of come together into this like story. And I think that this theory is attractive because it places us as the author of the script. Um, it creates a product that we call our life. And in the lifespan view, we get to the end of our lives, and we're basically engaged in what we would call a life review, sort of going over the chapters of our life and like, how well did I write this story? It's very agency oriented. You can rewrite the story. You can look at a bad chapter and rewrite current chapters to deal with those bad chapters. Some of it is out of your control. People can barge onto the stage, cause all kinds of havoc. But we can also fire them. Those kinds of things. There's all kinds of analogies that I think come along with narrative identity theory that I think are very powerful. And then finally, in terms of this construction sort of thing we've been going through, I want to look at Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis. And I talked about irrational beliefs when I was talking about those corollaries and how irrational beliefs can become part of our understanding of the world, these cognitive structures that affect the way we interact with the world. Now, Albert Ellis came upon the scene and essentially, as a clinician, felt that individuals' problems were very often associated with the fact that they were highly committed to what he called irrational beliefs. These were internalized corollaries. It's really the same thing. Internalized corollaries, how the world works, my place in it, what should I expect when I'm acting in the world, how should the world treat me, that these can sometimes be irrational. And our continued frustration with the fact that these beliefs seldom come true is the source of great anxiety. It's not too different than the philosophies that we hear sometimes of, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But yet that is the function of an irrational belief. If I believe something is supposed to happen, then no matter what happens, I'm still going to expect that to happen, and that's irrational. So in the course book, I go over a few of these that Ellis identified, and these were, from his perspective, essentially, they were points at which he would construct therapy processes. Let's take a look at this irrational belief. First, let's identify it. That truthfully, even though cognitively you might say, well, of course not everybody's going to like me, but yet your behaviors may indicate that you actually expect everyone to like you, because when someone doesn't like you, you're completely thrown off the rails. So he would try and help individuals to come to the realization that their belief systems were irrational. So we have here, look over here on page 324. It is a dire necessity for all adult humans to be loved and approved by virtually every significant other person in the community. One absolutely must be competent, adequate, and achieving in all important respects. If you're not, you're worthless. People absolutely must act considerately and fairly, and they are damnable villains if they do not. They are bad acts. They are their bad acts. I don't know even what I meant by that. They're bad actors, is what I meant there. It is awful and terrible when things are not the way one would very much like them to be. The point is, every single one of you, every single one of us, would look at these and say, of course these are irrational. But yet our behavior may reflect that we are acting as if these are the things, and we get pretty worked up about it. And the process of therapy with Albert Ellis was to bring rationality, to refocus and reconnect to the fact that these are not true. So that brings us to the end of this particular chapter, and we're only halfway through this video, so I want to make sure I get on here. In the discussion, I want you to look at the irrational beliefs that I just talked about, the ones I didn't talk about, and consider those. Have you looked at your most angst-related issue, or maybe somebody, that's perfectly okay. Talk about other people who you think, do you have some of these and you kind of get caught by it every once in a while? You had them in the past, now you're better. Do you know people who act in ways that are irrational? And kind of contextualizing this idea that these individuals, through their experience, constructed a reality, a schema. They're all the same: corollaries, schemas, irrational beliefs, rational beliefs. All of those make up some very, very important aspects of our personality. They really are some of the ways in which people can be most identified. When you come across somebody who has an irrational belief, it is pretty easy to identify, and that irrational belief can become very overpowering in their personality. In the chapter 19 assignment, or the chapter 19 assignment, the emphasis, I want you to tell a story. I want you to take a single event, and this is going to require that you reach out to people who were also part of that event. So I'm going to use the graphic on 322 to help with this. Page 322. The idea is you tell a story, and then you're going to analyze that story, that part of your narrative, to get the full story. Just imagine an individual writing a historical account of an event, and they were there. So they would, if a reporter just talked about their experience, that's one piece. However, there are other perspectives on that same event. Remember the individual corollary. There's other perspectives on that event that would make that picture more rich. make the story more rich. And we often see that in news items, different perspectives and whatnot. At least we hope we do. So here's that graphic that's in your course book. So we have S data. This is you. This is your narrative, your identity, what you saw happening. The B data is sort of the objective. Now, what I mean by that, it's you reflecting. You have the story, and then you have a reflection on objective aspects of it. So it's you becoming objective. What are things that are going on that were not necessarily me, that were other people? What was the facts of the situation and whatnot? Here's my story. Here's the facts of the situation. And then the third one we have here, the I data. This is other people who were there. So let me give you an example. I'm at a concert. So part of the story is my experience of a particular song that's being played. Let's say years ago, I went to see Elton John. It was just him on piano. I went with a couple other members of my band. We're an Elton John tribute band, so going to see Elton John sort of required. So we went to see him, and during one of his songs, I can't even remember what the song is, we actually kind of snuck onto the floor. Me and Gerald snuck onto the floor and tried to get really close. And my my experience with that, since I was in a band that played Elton John music, I'd been listening to Elton John music a lot, and his quality of musicianship within my mind was getting higher and higher. We approached the stage, and I became really, really, really nervous. Like, oh my God, he's right there. It was just really like this kind of like surreal experience, kind of thing. And then, so let's say I was going to tell that story, I would talk about, all those things. But I can also say, the concert was this. He was playing solo piano. I was there with these individuals. If I could remember the name of the song, it was this song. These are all that's the B data. And then I would interview Gerald and say, what was your experience of that? You were standing right next to me. We're like making our way through, got maybe 30 feet away, and couldn't go any further. And what was your experience of that? And get that information and tell the story from these three perspectives. Just an exercise in how narrative theory gets kind of more intricate. There's the story. When I was talking about this theory earlier, there's the story of the narrative, my life story. There's events in my life. Now we're going to enrich those like a reporter would by talking about not only the reporter's lived experience, you, but also the circumstances that were going on at that time, and then getting other people's perspectives. So this means picking an event. Other people were there. You can research the event to get all of the B data. You have your experience, and then you have another person's experience who was already there with you, who was also there with you. So that becomes the assignment for chapter 19. Now we go into chapter 20, and I'm going to go through this a little quickly. I know these videos can get a little long. We look at personality disorders, and whenever we're talking about disorders, we have to talk about the dichotomy of normal and abnormal. Now, abnormal, if you take an abnormal psych, hope that you got this. Abnormal from a psychological point of view is defined by three factors. First, statistically rare. For something to be abnormal, it can't be common. That common things are normal, which raises some questions about how norms change, kind of thing. So the pandemic, for example, some things that used to be abnormal became normal, and they were in many ways uncomfortable. And now we have a new normal, and we talk about these things, and those things that used to be abnormal are now normal. So these things change. Now that change has to do with the second factor. That's social norms. What does society or your culture, be it the big culture or just your family and friends, what do they consider to be the norms and expectations for your behavior? And then finally, and many would say that this is the line between abnormality and eccentric behavior, now, is function. To what degree does the behavior, in this sense, the abnormal personality, keep you from doing and participating in the events of life? Can you hold a job? Can you make friends? Can you hold relationships? Those kinds of things. When something meets all of those criteria, statistically rare, not accepted within the culture, and interfering with function, we're talking usually about mental illness. The eccentric idea is if an individual is able to function or doesn't need to function because they're being taken care of, it's not a problem, those kinds of things, then people can be very weird. And we see that kind of in the, like Kenye's ability to function has only been, first, he definitively has some mental health issues going on. And yet he's able to continue because he has such a support mechanism around him, and that allows him to be in these ways that in another context would run into someone's ability to function and would be considered abnormal, maybe addressed actively. Whereas with Kenya's life and his opinions and his, all of that stuff, we might see that he's sort of eccentric. So there's that. We have psychometrics specifically for abnormality. Now, you took the Big Five personality test. Now, you probably say, when you look at the Big Five here, I got a graphic on that too. When you look at the Big Five personality, most of us would score on there some pretty normal. That test is a measure of normal personality. Now, each one of those areas could, in fact, have extremes. So we have this graphic here where we look at, let's look at openness right in the middle there. We have openness, then we have even more than that, eccentricity, then magical thinking coming out of that. If really, really, really high openness. Then on the lower end, we have inflexibility, closed-mindedness. So each one of these characteristics of personality brought to an extreme could become problematic. But the Big Five is not a test of abnormal personality. And get the name of this, I love it, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, probably one of the most popular tests, broad range, looking at personality symptoms, personality characteristics that can then be brought together and used for the diagnostic processes of personality disorders. Still somewhat of an art form to kind of, nobody with those kinds of issues actually necessarily fits into any one of the boxes that we have. But, and there's always that consideration of function. Someone could be doing something that's rare. It could be something that is in violation of their culture. But if it's not illegal and the individual is still participating in most of the necessary things, yet that behavior is not necessarily going to be a problem. And so it might be a problem for some people around them, but nonetheless. So from instruments like the MMPI and a whole slew of instruments specific to the diagnostic criteria for various mental illnesses. All of these align with what some call the Bible of Abnormal Psych, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Currently, in the 5th edition, they put a little TR on there for text revised. They've done some textual revisions to the 5th edition. Now, the 5th edition, for anybody that's been working in the field of mental health, the 5th edition introduced some pretty radical changes from all the editions before that. We started to see personality disorders in a very, very different light. Started to see more spectrum related, that individuals would be on a spectrum. Not only did we see that in autism, but we also saw that in schizophrenia spectrum disorder, a range of different symptomologies and whatnot. A very, very different way of diagnosing. And there's also the ICD-11, 12, wherever it is now, the international diagnostic criteria that covers medical issues as well. There's that. Now then we see Millen's theory comes in here. We have, in the discussion of abnormal personality, so how does it come about? That's the etiology, the origins of the mental illness. And it evades us. I will tell you that our understanding of mental illness is still very much under development. We have medications that may help, sometimes they don't help, sometimes the side effects are worse than the effects, and all of that. We have this complexity. The complexity and failure of the mental health system means we're dealing with something very complicated. It's not the failure of individual human beings, although that does happen. It's this is a really, really challenging aspect of our science in psychology, is to come to an understanding of what mental illness is all about. Now, Millen, and he has, for personality theory, he has an evolutionary perspective. Now, I want to tie this. Here we are at the end. This is the last chapter. I want to tie this to everything. We think about all of our personality characteristics. Think about the big five. Think about your Myers-Briggs. Thinking about all the tests that we can have about what we're good at. There's built-in structures, the schemas that I just went over. Think of the whole class. Put this into a constructionist perspective and say, essentially, I built my personality in order to best adapt to my environment. If there's any measure of intelligence and the capacity of human beings on this planet, there's no being that is more adaptable than human beings. We live in every environment. We've been to space, been underwater, we fly, we climb mountains, we go places where human beings don't belong, and we thrive, for the most part. We also, can destroy ourselves, and we engage in war and meanness, all the things in between. This theory takes sort of a evolutionary language, using the language of evolutionary theory to describe that our personality, the construction of our personality, was adaptive. And sometimes the adaptations in our personality that at one time in our lives created the opportunity to continue functioning, later in our lives interfere with our functioning. So we might look at some of the personality disorders that we have, the symptoms of personality disorders, and we might think, well, if that person was being traumatized, and in order to survive, their personality, the individual created a personality characteristics for them to be able to dissociate from the current situation in order to not fully experience the pain and trauma, that may have been very, very much a part of that person's ability to function and survive that situation. However, now that that's ingrained as a personality characteristic, it gets applied. Remember the corollaries, it gets applied in situations that are not appropriate. A, they're not dangerous. B, people have to remain engaged. If they're at work or engaged in relationships or whatever, dissociation's not a good idea. But yet that individual's personality characteristics remain, and those may be difficult to change because they arose under such dire circumstances. That's a great theory. That's a great model for understanding how we adapt. Now, I mentioned a second ago about the pandemic and the movement of the norm needle and some of the ways in which we adapted, and all kinds of studies going on right now looking at the personality characteristics, mostly centered around the big five, how those enabled or got in the way of people having successful navigation through the pandemic. Then, even just as interesting, we see individuals' personalities were changed because they scored different now on the big five after the pandemic, and they have a new personality. So we see this adaptive quality to it. An individual who, up until that time, thrived on social interaction at work may have adapted to a way of working more independently, and that's now who they are. It's now that's their preferred mode of working. So we see this adaptation. Now, at the same time, we saw people who were not able to adapt. They were hurt by this. And so that's the discussion for chapter 20, our last discussion of the class, looking at personality problems that may be adaptations to the environment and things that are going on. Now, you can consider your own uniqueness. I was going to say weirdness, but that's not good. You can consider your own uniqueness. You can consider the pandemic. You can consider anything that happened to you. Or you can look, as I said before, you can look at other people and consider how their personality, their odd personality, may have been an adaptation to things that happened to them, or were done to them, or experiences that they had, those kinds of things. That's our discussion. And finally, I postponed it a week. It's now due, the autoethnography, which is actually a pretty straightforward assignment. It's just a matter of sitting down and starting it. You've done all of this work already. Now you're just putting it into a single document. Make sure you follow the rubric. Make sure you cover everything. Use bold titles. So when I'm going through that paper, it's like, oh, now they're talking about this item on the rubric. Now they're talking about this item on the rubric. Structure the paper based on the rubric. That's essentially what rubrics are for. My rubrics, at least, I go through the outline that I want to see that and things in that order. And that makes it easy to write, makes it easy to grade. So with that, here we are. We're at the end of the class. This is the last video that I'm going to put out. Next week is sort of, wrapping things up sort of thing. Been a pleasure. It's been an awesome class. And please get those evaluations done. I really, good, bad, and the ugly. Put it in there. I look forward to hearing feedback. Of course, I like to get positive feedback, but I love to get constructive criticism as well. This is a product that I'm making for you. Help me to make it better for the next round of people that come in. So take care. Been a great semester, and looking forward to reading all of your autoethnographies. I'll see you online, and take care.